Okay, let's do some exercises for Chapter 3, Lesson 6, Set 2. As the previous lesson, we're not going to do all of these problems, but just a reminder to apply your positive and negative rules properly. If you look at problem number 4, you're dividing negatives by positives and positives by negatives and negatives by negatives. So I think you probably could do most of this division quite simply in your head. The question is whether you get the positive or negative right. So that's really what's critical here. In number 5, again, similar to the one that we had in the previous lesson, you're just going to plug in the value of x. This time you're dividing by -1. And then there's a few questions there that they ask. And now we also read here number 6, and let's take a look here. We want to really take a deeper look at this because there are a lot of negatives that are being thrown into this one simple expression. The expression negative 6 over positive 3. Okay. Means the opposite. Okay, so with the opposite. Why is it the opposite? Because it's a negative versus the positive version of this same expression or value. Let's see, negative 6 over 3. You might say, well, hold on. Mr. Cartagena, I see a negative there again, so how could this be the opposite? Well, this is the positive version. Here we have a negative of -6 divided by 3, and this is the positive of -6 divided by 3. So really what they're just doing is they're compounding the negative value in this expression, in this fraction, and you're going to see that it's quite simple. We know that, for instance, the second one is -2, and that's what they say. Because -6 divided by, oh, excuse me, -3, yeah, is -2, all right? Let's put that over here. This is equal to -2. Now, I don't need to have, let me just get rid of that positive. It's implied, we know it's there. But -6 divided by 3 would be -2. Why? Because 3 times -2 would be -6, right? So the question is, what's going on over here? Let me give myself a little more room over here. We know that it's the opposite. Now, let's go back and we're going to use the, well, the opposite of -2 is +2. We know that, right? So we would say that this is +2. Now, I want to go a little further than what they did in explaining this. Well, we have the -6 divided by 3 is going to be -2, and we know that. So if we were to try to express this as we worked along, we would say it's the negative of -2, right? Or the opposite, we can say. And so what's the opposite of -2 would be +2. Okay? In this case, we simply got to -2, right? There was no negative on the outside. So we're taking the negative of a negative. It's simply like multiplying -1 times -2. Okay, remember that 1 is always hidden over there that I tell you? Well, they're giving this a negative value on top of it being negative. Similarly, it would just be like looking at this as -1 times -2. And I could put a little parentheses around this if it makes it easier for you to look at. And we know that that again yields +2. So it's compounding the negative value on top of maybe a negative value, or there's some negatives. So we just have to understand that we need to handle our negatives properly and apply them as many times as they say. So let's take a look at some of these problems here, and they tell us use the same reasoning to simplify each of the following expressions. So, okay, so we have now a -63 over 7. So what would that equal? Well, these are both positive and there's one negative here, so we know this answer is just going to simply be negative, and we divide 63 by 7, and the answer there is 9. So our answer is -9. Now let's go to B, and they say negatives of -12 divided by 4. Okay. Now, if it helps you to distinguish between these negatives, you can go ahead and put parentheses around this so you can see this. For it's value aside from the negative that's sitting here on the outside, and you can figure out what's in this parentheses first and then apply that negative. So let's just go back and say, well, what is negative 12 divided by 4? I'm going to put that in the parentheses and say, well, that's negative 3, because negative 3 times positive 4 equals negative 12. But now I have a negative of negative 3. So again, we're applying the negative of the negative, or the opposite again of the negative. Want to be careful using that language, but in a certain sense, that's kind of what we're looking at here. So that would be positive 3. Okay, we can also again look at this as the negative 1 being here multiplied by negative 3. Okay, so let's move to our next one. Now they're giving us a lot more negatives everywhere. Negative of negative 16 divided by negative 2. Well, again, I would recommend putting those parentheses just so we can compartmentalize. We can visually see what we need to do first, and that would be divide negative 16 by negative 2. So again, let's bring our negative over. Let's put our parentheses in. And what's negative 16 divided by negative 2? Well, the answer there is 8. It's positive 8. Because there are two negatives, negative divided by negative, and we also know that negative 2 times positive 8 would be negative 16. So the positive is, well, the answer is positive, but we still have this negative hanging out there, so we're going to apply the negative to the positive 8, and our answer would be negative 8. Now this may seem confusing, but really it isn't. It's just a matter of taking this step by step, applying the negatives step by step. If you look at this as a whole completely, you may not get the right answer. Now, with enough experience, you're going to take a look at this and you're going to realize something here. Something that those of us who have done math for so long, we see here just one negative in this expression, right? There's just one negative. So again, it's an odd number. You may remember doing the exponents with odd exponents and negatives. So you remember that odd number always, if there's an odd number of negatives, the answer is going to be negative. In this case, we actually had 2. Okay, so this one was odd number of negatives. Here we had 2 negatives. Okay, so it was an even number of negatives that are being applied. And again, I'm just using it in this scenario. This is not a universal application because depending upon how the expression is structured could make a difference as to whether or not the answer is going to be positive or negative. But in this particular case, how we're just making simple expressions, we're applying the negative onto the negative or the negative onto a positive. So in this case, we ended up with a positive. Okay. Now here, I'm looking at 3 of them. Okay. There's a negative divided by a negative, and then there's a negative, and again here's an odd number of negatives in this expression. And because I see this, I would automatically think to myself the answer is going to be negative. Now, don't want to necessarily see you jump to that conclusion until you figure out or apply the negatives and figure out what the answer is, and then as you go through applying positive and negative rules to solve the problem. But it's just an observation that I want you to make that could help you further down if you feel comfortable with the math and you understand how fractions are done and how we divide, how we multiply. You'll feel a lot more comfortable with that than if you do. You can certainly look at it this way. It's something that I do. I just immediately see, oh, 3 negatives, they're dividing and we're applying negative. This is going to be negative answer. Let's take a look at D, where we have 50 divided by negative 5, and this is a negative. Okay, so again, if I'm quickly looking at this, I'm thinking 2 negatives, even, answer is going to be positive. At least I'm thinking that way. But let's be careful. Let's just take it step by step. Dividing 50 by negative 5, that's going to yield, let's keep our negative, bring it over, and what's our 50 divided by negative 5? We know that's going to be positive, oh excuse me, negative 10. Negative 10, because negative 5 times negative 10 is going to yield positive 50, right? Negative 5 times negative 10 is equal to positive 50. But we still have this negative hanging out there. So now we're going with the negative of negative 10. Well, that would be positive 10. All right, and again, as I said, I saw 2. I saw an even number here. I immediately jumped into the conclusion correctly that it was going to be a positive answer. Let's jump up to our next one up here, E, and we're going to have negative of negative 36 divided by negative 6. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and put my parentheses. And when I apply my rules of negative divided by negative, I'm going to get a positive answer, right? So it's negative of positive 6, 36 divided by 6. And it's a negative, so the answer is negative 6. Okay, I don't really need the parentheses. I'm using the parentheses just to keep our negatives within, so we don't necessarily confuse all our negatives together. Here, the answer, I could just simply write negative 6. Okay. And again, hey, what do we see? 1, 2, 3. I saw an odd number of negatives. And I knew immediately it was going to be a negative answer. Let's go down to F. Negative 44 divided by, well, the negative of negative 44 divided by 11. And again, I'm just going to pop this around there. And what's negative 44 divided by positive 11? I could just think right off the top of my head, well, that's going to be a negative number, right? It's going to be negative 4, because negative 4 times 11 is negative 44. And again, it's the negative of negative 4, which means we're going to have a positive 4. And again, just so keeping track of our odds and evens, I could see here. Let's take the last two. We simply have negative 9 over 9. And 9 over 9 is equal to 1, so the answer here is negative 1. That was a pretty easy one there, huh? And then lastly, we have here, let's go to our last problem, and that would be negative 56 over negative 8. Now notice the way it's being written, and I want to just emphasize that when they put the negative way out here, they're saying that whatever is going on here, this entire fraction, it's the negative of this fraction. So in the case that we had here, this fraction, it was a positive. So it was the negative of that positive. And here we're seeing another scenario that we have. We have 56 divided by negative 8. We know that that answer is going to be negative, so it's the negative again of, I put my little parentheses. I could have put it over here. See how simple that one was. But 56 divided by 8 would be 7, or negative 7, because it's negative 8 rather. So again, we go negative of a negative, and our answer here is going to be positive 7. And again, we see here there was an odd number of negatives, and there's an even. Okay, so we've completed this exercise, and what's important is that we compartmentalize our information, eliminate some of these negatives. We have 3 negatives together in some scenarios, such as up here. We had a negative, and we had another negative, which turned it into a positive, but now we have to apply the negative out here onto a positive, which made it negative. Now this may all sound repetitious, but we have to understand how to deal with these negatives, and answers to problems are going to be presented in negatives of negatives and negatives of positives. So it's just really taking it step by step and applying the negative properly. And that's it for this problem. We'll move on to the next one.